The first taste of vanilla ice cream nearly brought Klaus Brenner to his knees. Standing in the sweltering Oklahoma heat of Camp Gruber, still wearing the torn Wehrmacht uniform that marked him as prisoner 847B, Klaus stared at the small white scoop melting in the paper cup. The American guard who'd handed it to him, a farm boy named Jimmy with gapped teeth and kind eyes, watched expectantly as other German prisoners gathered around, their faces masks of suspicion and wonder. "Go on," Jimmy encouraged in broken German. "Is good. Cold." Klaus had eaten nothing but watery soup and stale bread for 3 months during transport from the Normandy beaches to this sprawling prisoner of war camp in the American heartland. The propaganda films he'd watched in Hitler youth meetings had shown Americans as depraved gluttons, consuming while the noble German people sacrificed. Yet here was this guard, sharing his own ration with the enemy. The vanilla touched his lips, and Klaus's world fractured. Sweet, cold, impossibly rich. It was nothing like the ersatz desserts of wartime Germany or the bitter reality of military rations. As the vanilla dissolved on his tongue, something else dissolved too, the first hairline crack in 12 years of indoctrination. Around him, other prisoners began to taste. Hans Müller, the decorated panzer commander who still clicked his heels when officers passed, took a tentative lick and his eyes widened in amazement. Young Otto Fleischer, barely 18 and still believing they'd win the war from prison camp, nearly choked on the foreign sweetness. Even Sergeant Major Friedrich Weber, whose loyalty to the Reich remained absolute, couldn't hide his surprise at the gesture. "Mein Gott," whispered Klaus, and he wasn't taking the Lord's name in vain. 3 weeks earlier, Klaus Brenner had believed America was dying. The cattle car had carried them across an ocean of plains, past endless fields of corn and wheat that stretched beyond any horizon he'd known in Germany. Through the slats, he'd seen farmhouses with electric lights, automobiles parked in driveways, children playing in yards with toys he couldn't identify. It contradicted everything he'd been told about the decadent, struggling American economy. "Propaganda," muttered Hans Müller from the corner where he'd claimed space through sheer force of personality. At 42, the panzer commander still carried himself like the decorated veteran he was, though his uniform bore scorch marks from the Tiger tank that had become his tomb at Falaz. "They're showing us their best areas to demoralize us." Klaus nodded, wanting to believe it. At 26, he'd served as a communications officer with the 12th SS Panzer Division, trained to intercept Allied transmissions and coordinate tank movements. He'd been good at his job, proud of his service, certain of victory even as the Reich crumbled around them. The capture at Normandy had felt like a temporary setback, not the end of everything he'd believed.
Camp Gruber sprawled across thousands of acres of red Oklahoma earth, surrounded by double fences and guard towers that seemed almost casual compared to the fortress-like installations Klaus had seen in Germany. The American guards carried their weapons with relaxed familiarity rather than rigid precision, joking among themselves in a way that would have earned disciplinary action in the Wehrmacht. The processing had been methodical but not cruel. Each prisoner was photographed, questioned through interpreters, assigned a number and a barracks. Klaus found himself in Building 47 with 39 other men, ranging from teenage conscripts to career soldiers, united only by their capture and growing confusion about their captors. "They'll try to break us," warned Sergeant Major Weber during their first night. Weber had been a Nazi party member since 1931, wore his loyalty like armor, and commanded respect, even in defeat. "Comfort, kindness, small privileges, all designed to make us forget our duty to the fatherland." The barracks were clean, with actual mattresses and blankets. Each man had a footlocker, a shelf, and space to call his own. Electric lights provided steady illumination, and the latrines had running water with soap that actually produced suds. Klaus had spent the last year of the war in conditions so primitive that these basic amenities felt luxurious. But it was the small things that gnawed at him. The way guards said please when giving orders, the medical examination that checked for injuries and illness rather than weakness, the library of German books that included literature banned by the Reich for degenerate content. Most disturbing of all, the complete absence of systematic cruelty. Otto Fleischer, the youngest in their barracks, adapted with the flexibility of youth. He'd been conscripted at 17, captured during his first major engagement, and retained the enthusiastic nationalism of someone who'd never seen the war's true cost. "They're keeping us healthy for prisoner exchanges," he declared. "When we get back to Germany, we'll tell everyone how we resisted their attempts at corruption." Klaus wanted to believe it. Every night he lay on his comfortable mattress, listening to the sounds of a camp settling into sleep, no screams, no gunshots, no whispered prayers for dawn to come, and tried to reconcile it with everything he'd been taught about American brutality. The first meal had been a revelation in itself. Real meat, fresh vegetables, bread made with actual wheat flour. The portions were larger than many prisoners had eaten in months. Klaus found himself eating slowly, savoring each bite, while his mind raced with implications he didn't want to face. "It's a psychological operation," Hans explained during their second week. The former tank commander had taken on the role of unofficial leader among the enlisted men, his military experience and natural authority making others listen. "They want us soft and grateful," classic interrogation technique. Yet the interrogations, when they came, were surprisingly gentle. Klaus faced a young American lieutenant named Morrison, who spoke decent German and asked about military positions with the polite interest of an academic researcher rather than the aggressive intensity of a Gestapo agent. When Klaus refused to answer beyond name, rank, and serial number, Morrison simply nodded and offered him coffee. Coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd endured for years. The aroma alone was worth more than any information Klaus might have provided. "Were you at Normandy?" Morrison asked conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Rough fighting there. Lost a lot of good men on both sides." Klaus remained silent, but the lieutenant's casual acknowledgement of German losses as equally tragic struck him as peculiar. Where was the hatred, the contempt for the enemy that should have filled any proper military interrogation? The days settled into routine. Morning formation for count, breakfast in a mess hall that resembled a civilian cafeteria more than a military facility. Work details that felt more like job training than punishment. Klaus found himself assigned to the camp newspaper, translating articles about prisoner activities and war news for distribution among the German population. The war news proved particularly troubling. The American sources reported German defeats with factual precision, but without the gleeful propaganda Klaus expected. They acknowledged German tactical skills and mourned civilian casualties. Most disturbing of all, they provided details about concentration camps that Klaus had dismissed as Allied lies, details too specific and consistent to be fabricated. "Propaganda," Weber insisted whenever such reports circulated. "They want us to believe we're the monsters while they play the merciful conquerors. Don't let them poison your minds with guilt." But Klaus was beginning to wonder who was really spreading poison. The library became his refuge, filled with German classics that had been banned or heavily censored back home. He rediscovered Goethe, read Thomas Mann's critiques of German nationalism, found political philosophy that presented alternate.
And then there were the converts. Helmut Richter had been among the first to arrive at Gruber, a communications specialist like Klaus, but with more technical training. 6 months in American custody had changed him profoundly. He spoke English now, worked as a translator for the camp administration, and had requested permission to remain in America after the war. "They're not what we were told," Helmut confided during one of Klaus's visits to the administration building. "The Americans aren't weak or depraved. They're just different. They argue with their own government, criticize their leaders, even protest their own military actions." Can you imagine such freedom? Klaus could not. The concept of openly criticizing the state remained so foreign that he struggled to comprehend it as anything but chaos. Yet the camp functioned smoothly. Decisions were made, problems were solved, all without the rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience he'd believed necessary for any organization to survive. The turning point came during his third week when news arrived of Germany's unconditional surrender. Weber received the information with stoic denial. Temporary setback. The party will regroup. Secret weapons will turn the tide. This isn't over. Hans accepted it with a soldier's resignation. War's over. Time to figure out how to survive the peace. Otto broke down completely, weeping for the future that had been promised and would never come. What was it all for? What did we die for? Klaus felt something different. Relief so profound it terrified him. For the first time in years, he wouldn't have to kill anyone. Wouldn't have to watch friends die for causes that seemed increasingly meaningless. Wouldn't have to pretend that victory was possible when everything around him screamed of defeat. That night, lying in his bunk while others processed their grief and anger and confusion, Klaus stared at the ceiling and wondered what came next. The war was over, but his real education was just beginning. And it would start, he realized later, with a simple cup of vanilla ice cream and the revolutionary idea that enemies might also be human beings worthy of basic decency. The thought should have horrified him. Instead, for the first time in months, Klaus Brenner allowed himself to hope. The ice cream incident happened on a Tuesday in May, when the Oklahoma sun turned the camp into a furnace, and even the guards looked wilted by noon. Klaus had been working in the motor pool, learning to maintain American vehicles under the patient instruction of Sergeant Ray Kowalski, a Polish-American mechanic from Detroit who treated German engineering knowledge as something worth preserving rather than crushing. Your Panzers had good transmissions, overcomplicated but solid engineering, could teach our boys a thing or two about gear ratios. Such casual respect for German military technology would have been unthinkable in Klaus's previous understanding of American attitudes. According to Nazi propaganda, Americans saw Germans as either subhuman monsters or bumbling incompetents. The reality of professional respect between soldiers proved far more complicated and troubling. The ice cream truck's arrival created a stir throughout. The paper cup felt substantial in his hands, filled with a pale substance that seemed to glow in the harsh sunlight. Other prisoners gathered around, drawn by novelty and the fundamental human attraction to sweetness that transcended politics and nationalism. The first taste destroyed something in Klaus's mind. Not just the flavor, though that was revelation enough, pure, sweet, rich beyond anything he'd experienced in years of rationing and ersatz substitutes, but the gesture itself, the casual generosity of sharing precious resources with enemies, the complete absence of humiliation or strings attached. Hans Mueller's reaction proved equally telling. The hardened tank commander took his portion with military precision, but his expression softened as the cold sweetness hit his tongue. For a moment, the harsh lines around his eyes relaxed, and Klaus saw the man Hans might have been in peacetime, before war turned him into a weapon. Even Weber accepted his portion, though he ate it with the grimly dutiful expression of a man fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. "Calculated generosity," he muttered. "They're measuring our responses, documenting our weaknesses. Every bite is intelligence gathering." But Otto Fleischer laughed, actually laughed, with pure joy at the unexpected pleasure. "Mein Gott, this is incredible! How do they make it so cold, so sweet?" His questions tumbled out in rapid German, and Jimmy tried gamely to explain refrigeration and sugar rationing and the American dairy industry through gestures and broken phrases.
The scene crystallized something Klaus had been avoiding. These weren't monsters distributing ice cream as psychological warfare. They were young men sharing something they enjoyed with other young men who'd been denied such simple pleasures. The human connection transcended the uniforms and nationalities and recent history of violence. That evening, the barracks buzzed with discussion about the day's events. Weber attempted to maintain ideological discipline through his usual evening lecture about resistance and loyalty, but Klaus noticed several men listening with polite skepticism rather than fervent agreement. "They're softening us up," Weber declared. "Ice cream today, what tomorrow? Special privileges for those who cooperate? Better food for those who renounce the party? It's a classic corruption technique." Hans Müller, cleaning his boots with characteristic precision, looked up from his work. "Maybe, Friedrich, or maybe they just had extra ice cream and figured we'd enjoy it. Not everything needs to be a conspiracy." The casual challenge to Weber's authority sent ripples through the room. Hans commanded respect as a decorated combat veteran, but he'd never openly questioned Weber's political leadership before. Other prisoners watched the exchange with careful attention, sensing a shift in the barracks' power dynamic. Klaus found himself speaking before he'd planned the words. What if Weber's wrong? What if this isn't psychological warfare, but simple decency? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Weber's eyes narrowed with the look Klaus remembered from political officers during ideological instruction. Dangerous attention that could lead to punishment or worse. But they weren't in Germany anymore, and American guards didn't enforce Nazi Party discipline. "Careful, Klaus," Weber said quietly. "You're beginning to sound like you prefer your captors to your comrades."
"I prefer ice cream to empty promises," Klaus replied, surprised by his own boldness. "I prefer honest treatment to propaganda that tells me suffering is noble and pleasure is weakness. Maybe the Americans aren't perfect, but they haven't lied to me yet." Otto nodded enthusiastically from his bunk. "The guards are teaching me English. Did you know they have elections where people actually vote against the government and it's legal? Where newspapers can criticize leaders without being shut down?" "Propaganda," Weber snapped. "Designed to make you question everything you've been taught about proper order and discipline. They want you to believe chaos is freedom." But Hans was examining his boots with unusual attention to detail. "I've been watching them run this camp for weeks now, making decisions through discussion, following rules even when it's inconvenient, treating prisoners according to written regulations instead of personal whim. If that's chaos, it works better than most systems I've seen." The conversation continued long into the night, voices rising and falling in passionate debate about democracy versus authoritarianism, individual rights versus collective duty, the nature of loyalty, and the meaning of patriotism. Klaus listened to arguments he'd never heard presented fairly, ideas that had been dismissed without examination in every educational setting he'd known. By morning, the barracks had split into 3 distinct factions. Weber's loyalists still maintained Nazi ideology and resistance to American influence. Hans led a growing group of pragmatists who judged their captors by actions rather than preconceptions. Otto's enthusiasts embraced everything American with the fervor of converts. Klaus found himself caught between groups, fascinated by new ideas, but wary of abandoning everything he'd believed. The ice cream had been more than a frozen dessert. It was a catalyst that forced him to examine assumptions he'd never questioned. During his next work shift in the motor pool, Sergeant Kowalski noticed Klaus's distraction. The American mechanic had a gift for reading men's moods, developed through years of managing diverse crews in Detroit's automotive plants. "Something eating at you, Klaus? You look like a man wrestling with big questions."
Klaus considered his response carefully. His English had improved rapidly through necessity and practice, but complex ideas still challenged his vocabulary. In Germany, we learned that Americans are weak because they have too much comfort. But yesterday, guards share their ice cream with prisoners. He seems not weak, but generous? Kind? Kowalski laughed, but not unkindly. That's because you've been told stories about us, same as we've been told stories about you. I was ready to hate every German I met, figured you were all monsters after what we heard about the camps. Then I meet guys like you and Otto, and you're just soldiers who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves. The casual mention of concentration camps made Klaus's stomach tighten. American sources had provided increasingly detailed reports about systematic murder and industrial-scale killing that seemed too horrible to believe. Yet the specificity and consistency of accounts suggested truth rather than propaganda. The camps, Klaus said carefully. The reports about killing civilians. Is this real? Kowalski's expression grew grave. Real as can be. We've got...
The Americans feed us well and treat us fairly, he wrote. They share their food and teach us skills and respect our human dignity even as their enemies. I don't understand how people we were told were monsters can act with such decency while our own leaders... He stopped, unable to finish the thought that might condemn everyone he'd ever trusted. The letter would never be sent. Mail censorship worked both ways, and Klaus didn't want to burden Anna with his growing doubts while she struggled to survive in occupied Germany. But writing it helped clarify thoughts he'd been avoiding, questions that demanded answers he might not want to hear. Change, Klaus realized, was like ice cream melting on a hot day. Inevitable once the process began, impossible to reverse through willpower alone. The only choice was whether to embrace transformation or watch everything he'd believed dissolve into sticky, meaningless mess. For the first time since capture, Klaus Brenner began to consider the possibility that losing the war might have been the first step toward finding something better. The Coca-Cola arrived 3 days later, and with it came a revolution in Klaus's understanding of what America really meant. Jimmy Patterson bounded across the motor pool yard with the enthusiasm of a puppy, clutching glass bottles that caught the afternoon light like amber gems. Klaus had been working on a truck engine with Kowalski, debugging a carburetor problem that reminded him of similar issues with Wehrmacht vehicles, when the young guard's excitement proved too infectious to ignore. "You gotta try this," Jimmy announced, offering Klaus a bottle beaded with condensation. "Coca-Cola. Best thing since sliced bread, my daddy always said." Klaus accepted the bottle cautiously, studying the elegant script and distinctive shape. He'd heard references to the beverage in intercepted American communications during the war, something ubiquitous enough to serve as slang for American culture itself. Nazi propaganda had dismissed it as another example of capitalist decadence, a sugary drug used to pacify the masses while corporations grew fat on artificial desires. The opener produced a satisfying pop, followed by a sharp hiss of escaping carbonation. The sound was unlike anything Klaus had experienced, not the heavy thunk of beer bottles or the whistle of opening wine, but something lighter, more playful. Even the sound suggested a culture that valued pleasure over duty. Jimmy watched expectantly as Klaus raised the bottle to his lips. Around them, other prisoners and guards gathered with the casual camaraderie that had developed over weeks of shared work and gradually diminishing hostility. Otto Fleischer practically bounced with anticipation, while Hans Müller observed with the careful attention of a scientist studying an interesting experiment. The first sip exploded across Klaus's palate like nothing he'd ever experienced. Sweet, yes, but with a complexity that defied simple description. Citrus and vanilla and something undefinably spicy, all wrapped in aggressive carbonation that made his eyes water and his sinuses clear. It was liquid celebration, bottled joy, the essence of a culture that believed happiness was worth pursuing for its own sake. "Mein Gott!" Klaus breathed, staring at the bottle with newfound respect. "This is incredible! Otto laughed with pure delight at Klaus's reaction. "It's like drinking sunshine. How did they make it taste like this?" Jimmy launched into an enthusiastic explanation involving secret formulas and Atlanta factories and advertising campaigns that spanned the globe. His words tumbled over each other in his excitement to share something he'd taken for granted his entire life, but now saw through foreign eyes.
"My grandfather helped build one of the bottling plants in Nashville," Jimmy said proudly. "Said it was like being part of something bigger than yourself, you know? Bringing a little happiness to people all over the world." The concept struck Klaus as almost subversive. A product designed purely to give pleasure, distributed globally not as conquering force, but as invitation to shared experience. Where German industry focused on weapons and infrastructure and the machinery of empire, Americans had spent equal energy creating things that simply made life more enjoyable. Sergeant Kowalski watched Klaus's face with knowing amusement. "Different from what you expected, isn't it? Most Germans I've met figure we're either too soft or too brutal. Never occurs to them we might just be people who like fizzy drinks and baseball and giving our kids better lives than we had." Klaus took another sip, letting the carbonation dance on his tongue while his mind raced with implications. This wasn't strategic deception or psychological warfare. It was authentic generosity from people who'd been taught to hate him, but chose kindness instead. The contrast with everything he'd experienced in military service felt almost overwhelming. Weber appeared at the edge of the group, drawn by the commotion, but maintaining his characteristic disapproval. The sergeant major's expression suggested he'd discovered something personally offensive, which wasn't far from the truth. Weber understood the danger of small pleasures better than anyone. They led to larger questions about why such pleasures had been denied. "Enjoying your reward for collaboration?" Weber asked Klaus quietly. "Enjoying a drink offered in friendship," Klaus replied, surprising himself with the directness of his response. "Just as I'd offer water to a thirsty man regardless of his uniform." Weber's eyes narrowed. "Friendship with enemies is betrayal of comrades. That bottle represents everything our cause stood against. Capitalist corruption, artificial desires, the weakness that comes from pursuing pleasure over duty." Hans Müller had been listening while sampling his own Coca-Cola with the methodical approach he brought to everything. The former tank commander's verdict carried weight among the prisoners, and Klaus watched him carefully for signs of agreement or dissent. "Maybe it represents something else," Hans said thoughtfully. "Maybe it represents a culture that's confident enough to share what it has, successful enough to create luxuries for common people, secure enough to treat enemies as human beings worth basic decency." The challenge was quiet but unmistakable. Weber had built his authority on absolute certainty about American weakness and German superiority, but every day in the camp provided evidence that contradicted both assumptions. Hans was presenting an alternative interpretation that threatened the entire foundation of Weber's worldview. Klaus watched the confrontation with fascination and growing unease. These weren't abstract philosophical debates, but personal struggles over identity and meaning that would determine who these men became after the war ended. The bottles of Coca-Cola had become symbols of something larger, the possibility that they'd been wrong about everything. Otto Fleischer, with the tactical instincts of youth, chose that moment to ask the question everyone was avoiding. "Sergeant Major Weber, what if we were the bad guys?" The silence stretched painfully. Weber's face went through several colors before settling on dangerous red, but Otto continued with the relentless logic of someone too young to fear consequences. "I mean, they treat us better than our own officers did. They feed us better than we fed our prisoners. They share their luxuries and teach us skills and follow their own rules even when it's inconvenient. If we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, why does everything seem backwards?"
But Otto wasn't finished. What if the hard truth is that we followed leaders who lied to us? What if loyalty to the fatherland means admitting we made mistakes and trying to build something better? What if honor means accepting that our enemies might be better people than we were taught to believe? Klaus found himself nodding before he could stop the motion. Otto's questions echoed thoughts that had been growing since his arrival at Camp Gruber, doubts that crystallized with each act of casual American decency. The ice cream and Coca-Cola weren't corrupting influences, but revelations of what human relationships could be when they weren't poisoned by ideology and hatred. Kowalski, sensing the tension between the German prisoners, stepped forward with the easy authority of someone comfortable managing conflict. "Easy there, boys. No need to solve all the world's problems over a bottle of Coke. Klaus, you want to learn more about American engines? I've got a Ford V8 that needs attention." The offer provided graceful escape from a conversation that was heading toward dangerous territory. Klaus accepted gratefully, following the American sergeant away from the group while Weber stared after them with undisguised suspicion. As they worked on the engine, Klaus found himself asking questions that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "Sergeant Kowalski, how does American democracy really work? How do you make decisions without strong leadership?" Kowalski laughed while adjusting a spark plug. "Who says we don't have strong leadership? We just choose our leaders instead of having them chosen for us. Makes them work harder to keep us happy, you know? They screw up, we vote them out and try someone else." The concept of leaders accountable to followers rather than the reverse struck Klaus as almost incomprehensibly radical. But without absolute authority, how do you maintain order? How do you ensure unity of purpose? "Same way this engine works," Kowalski replied, gesturing at the mechanical complexity surrounding them. "Lots of different parts doing different jobs, but all working toward the same goal. You don't need one part controlling everything, you need all the parts working together, each one doing what it does best." The metaphor resonated in ways Klaus couldn't fully articulate. He'd been trained to think of society as a military hierarchy, with unquestioning obedience flowing upward and absolute commands flowing down. But what if human organizations were more like engines, complex systems where individual components contributed to collective success without sacrificing their essential nature? That evening, Klaus found himself writing another unsent letter to Anna, trying to process thoughts that challenged everything they'd been taught to accepting. "I'm learning things here that make me question not just the war, but the entire system we grew up accepting. What if the strength we were taught to admire was actually weakness? What if the freedom we were taught to fear was actually strength?" The questions felt treasonous, even in the privacy of his own mind, but Klaus could no longer avoid them. The Coca-Cola had been more than a beverage. It was liquid proof that joy and generosity and simple human pleasure were not signs of decadence, but expressions of a healthy society that cared about its people's happiness. As he lay in his comfortable bunk that night, listening to the sounds of men processing their own transformations, Klaus realized that his education was just beginning. The war had ended, but his real battle, the struggle between everything he'd believed and everything he was learning, was heating up. And, like ice cream melting on a summer day, there would be no going back to what he'd been before. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in June, carried by Major Thompson with a sort of careful neutrality that suggested bad news delivered with military precision. Klaus had been working in the camp library, helping Mrs. Henderson catalog new German books donated by American universities, when the summons came. "Prisoner 847B, report to the administration building immediately." Klaus's stomach clenched with familiar dread. Summons to headquarters had meant interrogation, punishment, or worse during his Wehrmacht service. Even weeks of gentle treatment at Camp Gruber couldn't entirely erase the reflex of fear of official attention.
The administration building was a study in American efficiency. Clean lines, modern equipment, and an atmosphere of professional competence that reminded Klaus of corporate offices rather than military installations. Major Thompson's desk was organized, but not obsessively so. decorated with family photos that humanized the stern-faced officer who ran the camp with firm but fair authority. "Sit down, Klaus," Thompson said in his serviceable German. "I have news from home." The letter bore Klaus's address in handwriting he recognized as his sister Anna's, though the penmanship was shakier than he remembered. The paper felt thin, poor quality that suggested continuing shortages in occupied Germany. The postmark was 3 months old, not unusual given the disrupted postal system and military censorship. Klaus's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, aware that Thompson was watching his reaction with professional interest. Inside was a single sheet covered in Anna's familiar script, but the words themselves seemed to come from a stranger. "My dear Klaus," the letter began, "I pray this finds you well, wherever you are. The Americans told us you're alive and uninjured, which is more than we know about so many others. Berlin is difficult to describe. I don't know what they've told you about the situation here, but I hope you're prepared for what you'll find if you come home." The letter went on to describe systematic destruction, mass starvation, and social collapse that defied Klaus's understanding of temporary military occupation. Anna wrote of women trading family heirlooms for moldy potatoes, of children who'd forgotten what milk tasted like, of former party officials denying their past while desperate civilians struggled simply to survive another day. But it was the personal revelations that hit Klaus hardest. "Mother died in February," Anna wrote with devastating simplicity. "Pneumonia, but really just exhaustion from trying to keep us fed and warm with no fuel and no medicine. She kept asking about you until the end, wondering if her son was safe somewhere. I told her you were strong and clever and would survive anything. I hope I was right." Klaus's eyes turned dangerously blurry. His mother, who'd packed his bags with such care when he left for military service, who'd written cheerful letters about neighborhood gossip even as bombs fell on Berlin, was gone, dead while he'd been discovering ice cream and Coca-Cola and the revolutionary possibility that enemies could be kind. The letter continued with worse news. Father went to live with Uncle Heinrich in Hamburg. The factory where he worked for 30 years was completely destroyed, and at his age, no one wants to hire him for reconstruction work. He seems broken in ways I can't fix. He talks constantly about the old days, about how things used to be, about how we'll rebuild and make everything strong again. I don't have the heart to tell him there's nothing left to rebuild. Klaus's father, the skilled machinist who'd taught him precision and pride in workmanship, reduced to a broken old man clinging to fantasies of restoration. The image contradicted everything Klaus had believed about German resilience and national character. Major Thompson waited patiently while Klaus processed the information, offering neither comfort nor intrusion. When Klaus finally looked up, the American officer's expression showed genuine sympathy rather than the satisfaction of an enemy enjoying German suffering. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thompson said quietly. "Losing family while you're unable to help or even say goodbye, that's one of the hardest things a soldier faces." Klaus nodded, unable to trust his voice. The major's genuine sympathy felt almost unbearable after weeks of questioning everything he'd been taught about American callousness toward German suffering. "There's more," Anna's letter continued. "Klaus, I need you to know what really happened here, what we did, what was done in our name. The camps the Americans talk about, they're real. I've seen the films they show in the theaters now, the photographs they post on walls, the systematic murder of Jews, of disabled people, of anyone the party decided was unworthy of life. It happened, Klaus. We let it happen."
The words hit Klaus like physical blows. He'd been avoiding this truth for weeks, pushing away evidence and testimony and documentation because accepting it would mean accepting that everything he'd fought for was monstrous,
but Anna's letter made denial impossible. "I keep thinking about the Rosenberg family who lived next door," she wrote. "How they disappeared one night and we all pretended not to notice. How we told ourselves they'd been relocated, that it was temporary, that someone else was handling the details. We were cowards, Klaus. Worse than cowards. We were complicit." Klaus felt bile rise in his throat. He remembered the Rosenbergs, Mr. Rosenberg, who'd repaired watches with incredible patience, Mrs. Rosenberg, who'd baked cookies for the neighborhood children, their daughter Sarah, who'd been in Anna's class at school. They'd vanished during his basic training, and Klaus had accepted the official explanation without question. Major Thompson was reading Klaus's expression with professional skill. "The hardest part of defeat isn't admitting you lost," he said gently. "It's admitting what you might have won." The observation cut through Klaus's defenses with surgical precision. Victory would have meant validating everything: the camps, the systematic murder, the reduction of human beings to categories of worthy and unworthy. Victory would have meant spreading those horrors across the world, calling them justice and progress and national destiny. "I don't know how to live with this knowledge, how to build a life on the foundation of such terrible truth. But I know we have to try. We owe it to the people who died, to the future we want to create, to become better than we were. I hope wherever you are, whatever you're learning, you're finding a way to do the same. Your sister, Anna." Klaus folded the letter carefully, his hands steady, despite the emotional earthquake rocking his foundations. Major Thompson waited patiently, clearly accustomed to such moments of personal crisis among his prisoners. "She's right, you know. About the camps, about what we did. I've been avoiding the truth, but I can't anymore." Thompson nodded. "Truth is often harder to face than bullets, but it's the only foundation strong enough to build something better on." Klaus stood up, feeling older than his 26 years. "May I return to my duties, sir?" "Of course." "Klaus?" The major's voice stopped him at the door. "Grief is normal. Guilt is understandable. But don't let either one stop you from moving forward. Your sister sounds like a wise woman. Listen to her advice about becoming better than you were." Klaus walked back to the library in a daze, Anna's words echoing in his mind like artillery shells. Mrs. Henderson took one look at his face and quietly assigned him to simple organizational tasks that required no concentration, understanding that some revelations needed time to settle before they could be processed. The afternoon passed in mechanical routine, sorting books, updating catalog cards, arranging shelves with the precision his father had taught him. But underneath the familiar motions, Klaus felt foundations shifting like tectonic plates adjusting to new pressures. That evening in the barracks, he found himself in the middle of another heated discussion between Weber's loyalists and the growing number of men who questioned everything they'd been taught. Otto Fleischer had been arguing with Wilhelm Kruger, one of Weber's most devoted followers, about the nature of patriotism and duty. Patriotism means serving your country, not abandoning everything the moment your enemies offer you candy. What if serving your country means admitting it made mistakes? What if real patriotism means helping build something better instead of defending something evil? Klaus found himself speaking before he'd planned the words. "I got a letter from home today. My mother is dead. My father is broken. My sister is trying to rebuild from the ruins of everything we believed in."
Weber's face had gone pale with fury. "You're betraying everything your comrades died for, everything your mother sacrificed for, everything that made Germany great." "Germany was never great," Klaus said with quiet conviction. "We were efficient, disciplined, militarily skilled. But greatness requires moral courage, and we had none. We followed orders without questioning their righteousness. We accepted comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. We let our government commit crimes against humanity while we pretended not to know. The confrontation had attracted attention from surrounding bunks. Klaus realized he was speaking for more than himself. Otto nodded enthusiastically. Hans watched with thoughtful approval, and even some of Weber's supporters looked uncertain about their automatic loyalty. "So what do you propose?" Weber asked dangerously. "Complete capitulation to our enemies? Abandoning every principle that ever meant anything to German people?" "I propose learning from our enemies. Learning that democracy isn't chaos, but a system that holds leaders accountable. Learning that individual rights aren't selfishness, but the foundation of human dignity. Learning that a culture can be strong enough to share ice cream with its prisoners and confident enough to admit its own mistakes." The argument continued late into the night, voices rising and falling in passionate debate about identity and values and the possibility of redemption through transformation. But Klaus felt a strange peace settling over him as he defended positions he'd never imagined holding just weeks earlier. Anna was right. They had to become better than they'd been. And Klaus was beginning to understand that becoming better meant accepting the radical possibility that their enemies might have valuable lessons to teach about what human societies could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conquest, kindness over cruelty, hope over fear. The letter had cracked something fundamental in Klaus's understanding of himself and his world. But like ice cream melting in Oklahoma heat, the old certainties couldn't be restored once they dissolved. The only choice was to embrace whatever came next. The baseball game happened by accident, the way most important revelations do. Klaus had been returning from his shift in the motor pool when he heard the distinctive crack of bat meeting ball, followed by cheering that transcended language barriers. Curious despite himself, he followed the sound to a makeshift diamond where American guards and German prisoners had organized themselves into mixed teams for an impromptu game. Jimmy Patterson stood at home plate, gripping a wooden bat with the concentrated intensity of someone taking athletics very seriously. Behind him, Otto Fleischer crouched in an approximation of catching position, having clearly never seen the game before, but gamely attempting to learn through observation and enthusiasm. "Strike two," called Sergeant Morrison, the intelligence officer who'd interrogated Klaus with such gentle persistence. Morrison was serving as umpire with the sort of careful fairness that characterized everything Klaus had observed about American military professionalism. The pitcher was Hans Merler, who'd apparently adapted his tank commander's precision to the art of throwing strikes. His delivery was mechanically perfect, but lacked the casual grace of natural athletes, the result of German engineering applied to American leisure. Klaus found himself drawn into the crowd of spectators, a mix of guards and prisoners who cheered good plays regardless of uniform allegiance. The casual integration would have been unthinkable in any German military setting, but here it seemed as natural as Oklahoma sunshine. Jimmy swung at Hans' next pitch and connected with a satisfying crack that sent the ball soaring toward the fence. He dropped the bat and sprinted toward first base with obvious joy, while Otto scrambled after the ball with comic determination. "Run, Jimmy, run!" shouted several prisoners in broken English, their excitement overcoming any residual sense of national loyalty. Klaus found
The game continued with the sort of cheerful chaos that characterized most activities when linguistic barriers met cultural differences. Rules were explained through gestures and broken translations. Disputes were settled with good-natured compromise, and everyone seemed more interested in participation than victory. Klaus was watching from the sidelines when Weber appeared beside him, his expression suggesting he'd discovered something personally offensive. Fraternization with the enemy, Weber observed coldly. Playing their games, adopting their culture, forgetting your duty to fallen comrades who died fighting these very men? Klaus turned to study Weber's face, seeing something he'd missed before, not righteous anger, but desperate fear. Fear that his authority was crumbling, that his worldview was being challenged, that the men he'd tried to keep loyal were finding better alternatives to blind obedience. "They're not our enemies anymore, Friedrich," Klaus said gently. "The war is over. These are just young men playing a game, sharing what they enjoy with people who've never experienced it. There's no betrayal in enjoying simple human fellowship." Weber's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Simple human fellowship. These are the men who bombed our cities, killed our friends, destroyed everything we built. And you want to play games with them? These are also the men who feed us well, treat us fairly, and share their ice cream and Coca-Cola. The men who follow their own rules even when it's inconvenient, who show respect for prisoners even when we don't deserve it. Maybe the fellowship is more real than the enmity ever was. On the field, Otto had figured out the basics of catching and was providing enthusiastic commentary in rapid German that made everyone laugh despite understanding nothing. His joy was infectious, transcending every barrier of language and nationality in recent history. Weber watched the scene with undisguised disgust. Look at him. Look at all of them. They've forgotten who they are, where they come from, what they owe to the fatherland. They're becoming American pets, performing tricks for their captors' amusement. Klaus considered Weber's words while watching Otto dive for a ground ball with theatrical determination. Or maybe they're becoming human beings again. Maybe that's what happens when you stop defining yourself by who you hate and start discovering what you can love. The observation struck Weber like a physical blow. His face went through several colors before settling on dangerous red, and Klaus realized he'd crossed some invisible line in their ongoing ideological battle. "You're lost to us," Weber said quietly, "completely corrupted by comfort and flattery. When this war ends and we return to Germany, you'll find that collaboration has consequences. The fatherland has long memory for those who betrayed her in her darkest hour." Klaus felt a chill that had nothing to do with Oklahoma weather. Weber's threat carried weight because it reflected attitudes that would likely persist among those Germans who'd never experienced American decency firsthand. Klaus would return to a homeland where kindness might be seen as weakness and moral flexibility as treachery. But watching Otto laugh with pure joy as he successfully caught a popfly, Klaus realized he no longer cared about Weber's threats. Some transformations were worth any price, and becoming fully human again was one of them. Maybe I am lost to hatred and blind obedience and the worship of strength for its own sake. If that's betrayal, I'm guilty as charged. Weber stared at him with the expression of someone watching a friend die, then turned and walked away with military precision. Klaus watched him go with mingled sadness and relief. Sadness for a man trapped by ideologies that no longer served him. Relief at finally choosing sides in a battle between past and future. The game ended with handshakes and good-natured ribbing about athletic skills and rule interpretation.
Klaus found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided, "Yes, I think I'd like that very much." "Great! Otto's been asking about American music too, if you want to join us for record listening tonight. We've got some good swing bands that might surprise you." The invitation represented another small step away from everything Klaus had been and toward something he might become. "I'd enjoy that, Jimmy. Thank you for including me." As they walked back toward the barracks, Klaus reflected on the distance he'd traveled in just a few weeks. From captured enemy to welcome participant in American culture. From ideological certainty to curious exploration of alternative values. From defining himself through hatred to discovering identity through fellowship. That evening, gathered in the recreation hall with a mix of prisoners and guards,
Klaus heard American music for the first time, jazz and swing and popular songs that celebrated love and hope and the simple pleasure of being alive. The music was complex and sophisticated in ways that contradicted every stereotype about American cultural shallowness. Otto danced with unself-conscious enthusiasm, while Jimmy tried to teach him basic swing steps. Hans discussed musical theory with Sergeant Morrison, comparing American jazz to German classical traditions and finding unexpected common ground. Even some of Weber's supporters listened with obvious enjoyment, their ideological resistance weakening in the face of irresistible rhythm and melody. Klaus found himself tapping his foot to Benny Goodman's clarinet, amazed by music that combined technical excellence with pure joy. This was what Anna had meant about becoming better than they'd been. Not abandoning their culture, but expanding it. Not betraying their identity, but enriching it with the best of what other societies had achieved. The evening ended with a group sing-along of In the Mood, prisoners and guards alike attempting lyrics in multiple languages while the record player provided professional accompaniment. Klaus sang with the others, his voice blending into a harmony that transcended every artificial barrier humans had constructed between themselves and their neighbors. Walking back to his barracks under Oklahoma stars, Klaus reflected on the distance he'd traveled in just a few weeks. From captured enemy to welcome participant in American culture, from ideological certainty to curious exploration of alternative values, from defining himself through hatred to discovering identity through fellowship. The letter Klaus finally decided to send took 3 drafts and 2 sleepless nights to complete. He sat in the camp library on a quiet Sunday morning, surrounded by German literature that had been banned by his own government for containing dangerous ideas about human dignity and individual conscience. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had to travel halfway around the world and become a prisoner of war to freely read the best of his own culture's intellectual heritage. Mrs. Henderson worked quietly at her desk, cataloging donations and occasionally glancing over with grandmotherly concern. She'd become protective of the German prisoners who frequented her library, treating them with the same gentle encouragement she'd probably shown her own grandchildren learning to read. "Difficult letter?" she asked during one.
Mrs. Henderson considered his question while adjusting her reading glasses. Perhaps you start by acknowledging that being wrong isn't the same as being evil. Good people can believe bad ideas if they're never given alternatives to consider. The courage comes in changing your mind when you encounter better information. Her words resonated with truths Klaus had been struggling to articulate. He returned to his letter with renewed focus, determined to find language that conveyed transformation without condemning the person he'd been before. My dear Anna, your letter about Mother's death and the situation in Germany has forced me to confront truths I've been avoiding. You were right about the camps, about our complicity, about the need to become better than we were. But I want to tell you about what better might look like, because I'm living it here in ways I never expected. He paused, considering how to explain experiences that challenged every assumption about American-German relations. How could he describe ice cream shared without humiliation, work assignments that felt like job training rather than punishment, guards who treated prisoners as human beings worthy of basic dignity? The Americans are not what we were taught to expect. They're neither weak nor cruel, neither stupid nor vindictive. They're simply people trying to do their jobs with fairness and efficiency, and they've succeeded in ways that shame everything I thought I knew about strength and leadership.
The letter grew longer as Klaus attempted to capture the complexity of his transformation. He wrote about baseball games that included former enemies as welcome participants, about music that celebrated joy rather than martial glory, about conversations that explored ideas rather than enforcing conformity. I've learned that democracy isn't chaos, but accountability. That individual rights aren't selfishness, but the foundation of human dignity. That a society can be strong enough to treat its enemies with kindness and confident enough to admit its own mistakes. As he wrote, Klaus became aware of other prisoners in the library engaged in similar struggles. Otto Fleischer was composing what appeared to be an enthusiastic letter about American culture and values, his young face bright with the excitement of discovery. At another table, Wilhelm Kruger, one of Weber's most loyal supporters, wrote with obvious difficulty, perhaps wrestling with his own growing doubts about Nazi ideology. Even Hans Müller sat in the corner, reading what looked like a philosophy book with the same systematic attention he'd once devoted to tank manuals. The former panzer commander was clearly reconstructing his worldview from the ground up, approaching the task with characteristic German thoroughness. Klaus returned to his letter, trying to find words for the most important revelation of all. Anna, I think the reason their kindness affects me so deeply is because it represents what human society could be if we chose cooperation over conquest, understanding over hatred, hope over fear. They're not perfect, no society is, but they're trying to build something that serves human flourishing rather than human domination. The admission felt like crossing a final bridge between his old identity and whatever he was becoming. Klaus had spent years believing that strength came from the ability to inflict suffering on others. But the Americans had shown him that true strength came from the ability to choose mercy, even when vengeance was possible.
I don't know what will happen when the war officially ends and we're allowed to return home, he continued. I don't know if the lessons I've learned here will survive the challenges of rebuilding Germany. But I know I can never again accept that following orders absolves me of moral responsibility, or that loyalty to country requires abandoning conscience, or that true strength comes from the ability to hurt others rather than help them. Mrs. Henderson had been watching his progress with obvious approval. When Klaus finally finished and sealed his letter, she approached with the gentle smile he'd come to associate with American maternal authority. That looked like important writing, she observed. Klaus nodded, still processing the emotions that had accompanied his written confession of transformation. I was trying to explain to my sister how everything I believed has changed since coming here. Change is never easy, Mrs. Henderson replied, but it's often necessary for growth. Your sister sounds like a wise woman. I suspect she'll understand better than you think. Klaus hoped she was right. Anna had always been the more thoughtful of the two siblings, the one who questioned easy answers and looked for deeper meanings. If anyone could understand his journey from Nazi certainty to democratic possibility, it would be her. That evening, Klaus joined the informal discussion group that had formed around Hans Müller's methodical exploration of political philosophy. Tonight, they were discussing Kant's categorical imperative and its implications for individual moral responsibility. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, Hans read from the book he'd borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's collection. It's a simple test for ethical behavior. Would the world be better if everyone acted as you're acting? Otto raised his hand like an eager student. So if we apply that to following orders, we'd have to ask whether the world would be better if everyone always followed orders without question. Klaus found himself speaking before he had fully formed his thoughts. And the answer is clearly no. If everyone followed orders without moral consideration, then whoever gave orders would have unlimited power to commit any atrocity they chose. The responsibility to think,
To judge, to refuse immoral commands that can never be surrendered to authority. The discussion continued with the sort of passionate intellectual engagement Klaus had never experienced during his formal education. These men were thinking for themselves, questioning fundamental assumptions, building new understanding from careful examination of evidence and logic. Wilhelm Kruger had been listening with obvious discomfort, his loyalty to Nazi ideology warring with the logical implications of their philosophical exploration. Finally, he spoke with the frustrated voice of someone losing an argument he desperately needed to win. But if individual conscience trumps legitimate authority, how do you maintain order? How do you achieve anything when everyone thinks they know better than their leaders? Hans looked up from his book with the patient expression of a teacher helping a student work through difficult concepts. Perhaps the question is how you ensure that authority remains legitimate. The Americans seemed to manage it by requiring their leaders to justify their
As the evening ended and men drifted back to their barracks, Klaus reflected on how far they'd all traveled from the certainties that had carried them into war. The transformation wasn't just personal but communal. They were becoming a different kind of German, one that might be capable of building a different kind of Germany when they returned home. The letter he'd sent to Anna represented more than personal confession. It was a declaration of intent to carry these lessons forward, to become part of whatever reconstruction lay ahead, to help build something better from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. Klaus fell asleep that night thinking about ice cream and Coca-Cola and baseball games, simple pleasures that had somehow opened pathways to profound truths about human nature and social organization. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice what he'd learned about choosing kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, hope over fear. The taste of freedom, once experienced, created hunger for more. Weber's counterattack came on a Tuesday morning in July, swift and brutal as any military operation he'd ever planned. Klaus was teaching Otto basic automotive maintenance in the motor pool when the confrontation erupted in the nearby recreation hall. Angry voices in rapid German carried clearly across the compound, followed by the unmistakable sound of furniture being overturned and men struggling. By the time Klaus and Otto reached the scene, a crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a tribunal in progress. Weber stood at the center like a prosecuting attorney, flanked by his most loyal supporters, facing Hans Mueller, who sat in a chair with blood trickling from his nose and his hands bound behind his back. "Collaboration," Weber announced to the assembled prisoners, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Systematic betrayal of comrades, country, and cause. Hans Mueller has crossed the line from prisoner of war to active enemy of the German people." Klaus felt his stomach clench with recognition of kangaroo court justice. He'd seen similar scenes during the war, informal tribunals where ideological purity was enforced through intimidation and violence. The fact that it was happening here, in the heart of American democratic territory, seemed particularly obscene. Hans maintained his dignity despite his obvious injuries, meeting Weber's accusations with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced worse enemies than fellow Germans. "I am guilty of thinking for myself. If that's collaboration, I accept the charge." Weber's supporter Wilhelm Kruger held up a letter like evidence in a criminal trial. "Writing to your wife about the superiority of American democracy, praising enemy culture while condemning German traditions, urging her to prepare for necessary changes in German society after the war." Klaus recognized the letter as similar to his own correspondence with Anna, honest accounts of transformation that challenged anti-Nazi ideology in favor of democratic values. The idea that such letters constituted betrayal rather than growth struck him as profoundly evil. Otto stepped forward with the fearless indignation of youth confronting injustice. "What gives you the right to judge anyone? The war is over. We're prisoners, not soldiers. Hans has every right to think and write whatever he chooses."
Weber's eyes fixed on Otto with predatory intensity. And here's another traitor, corrupted by American flattery into forgetting his duty to fallen comrades. How many German soldiers died fighting the democracy you now embrace? How many sacrificed everything to resist the cultural poison you now celebrate? The accusation carried weight because it contained truth. German soldiers had died believing they fought for something worthy, and their sacrifice deserved respect even if their cause had been fundamentally wrong. Klaus felt the moral complexity of their situation like a weight on his chest. But Hans answered with the voice of someone who'd wrestled with that very question and found peace with his conclusions. They died believing lies we were all told. Honoring their sacrifice means ensuring that future generations aren't fed the same poison. It means building something better from the ruins of what we destroyed. Weber's face contorted with rage at Hans's calm defiance. Better? You call abandoning everything that made Germany great better? You call embracing the culture of our enemies honor? Klaus found himself stepping forward before he'd consciously decided to intervene. Germany was never great through conquest and cruelty, Friedrich. We were efficient at evil, but that's not the same thing. These Americans have shown us what real strength looks like, the strength to choose mercy over vengeance, growth over stagnation, hope over fear. The crowd of prisoners turned to watch Klaus with the fascinated attention of people witnessing a dramatic confrontation between opposing worldviews. Weber's supporters remained loyal, but looked increasingly uncertain about their position, while Hans's allies gathered courage from seeing him defended. Weber turned his full attention to Klaus with the sort of dangerous focus that had made him effective during wartime. Klaus Brenner, Communications Officer, 12th SS Panzer Division. I remember you from the beginning, proud, disciplined, loyal to the cause. Look what they've made of you with their ice cream and soft words. Look how completely they've broken you. Klaus felt the moment's weight, understanding that his response would influence every man present and possibly determine the future direction of German prisoner attitudes. He chose his words carefully, speaking not just to Weber, but to everyone struggling with questions of identity and loyalty and the possibility of redemption. They didn't break me, Friedrich. They showed me what I could become if I stopped being afraid of thinking for myself, if I stopped worshiping strength and started valuing kindness, if I stopped defining myself by who I hated and started discovering what I could love. The philosophical difference between their positions became crystal clear in that moment. Weber represented the old Germany of unquestioning obedience and tribal loyalty, while Klaus embodied the possibility of a new Germany based on individual conscience and universal human dignity. Weber's response came with military precision. Then you're no longer German in any meaningful sense. You're an American pet, performing tricks for your captor's amusement. When we return home and rebuild the fatherland, there will be no place for traitors who abandon their people in the darkest hour. The threat carried real weight because Weber spoke for attitudes that would likely persist among many Germans who'd never experienced American decency firsthand. Klaus would face serious consequences for his transformation when he returned to a homeland where change might be seen as weakness and moral flexibility as betrayal. But Klaus had moved beyond fear of Weber's disapproval or future retribution. They didn't break me, Friedrich. They showed me what I could become if I stopped being afraid of thinking for myself, if I stopped worshiping strength and started valuing kindness, if I stopped defining myself by who I hated and started discovering what I could love. The philosophical difference between their positions became crystal clear in that moment. Weber represented the old Germany of unquestioning obedience and tribal loyalty, while Klaus embodied the possibility of a new Germany based on individual conscience and universal human dignity. Weber's response came with military precision. Then you're no longer German in any meaning.
Sergeant Morrison arrived with several guards, drawn by reports of disturbance in the recreation hall. The American officer took in the scene with professional efficiency. Bound prisoner, angry crowd, obvious tension between opposing factions. "What's the situation here?" Morrison asked in his serviceable German. Weber straightened into military posture, clearly seeing an opportunity to demonstrate German discipline to American authority. "Internal discipline matters, sir, dealing with collaboration and betrayal according to military justice." Morrison's expression hardened with the look Klaus had learned to associate with American displeasure at authoritarian behavior. "In this camp, we follow American military justice. Cut that man loose immediately." Weber's supporters hesitated, clearly torn between obedience to German authority and submission to American commands. The moment crystallized their fundamental dilemma: which loyalty took precedence when they conflicted? Morrison didn't wait for compliance. He gestured to his guards, who quickly cut Hans's bonds and helped him to his feet. The efficiency of American intervention demonstrated exactly the kind of principled authority Klaus had come to respect. "This facility operates according to Geneva Convention standards," Morrison continued. "That means no prisoner tribunals, no vigilante justice, no intimidation of men who choose to think for themselves. Anyone who has problems with those rules can spend time in solitary confinement thinking about them." Weber's face went through several colors as he processed the implications of American protection for prisoners who embrace democratic values. His entire strategy of maintaining ideological control through intimidation had just been neutralized by enemy intervention on behalf of German traitors. Klaus watched Weber's humiliation with complex emotions. Part of him felt satisfaction at seeing authoritarian bullying thwarted by democratic principles. But part of him also felt sadness for a man trapped by ideologies that no longer served him, unable to adapt to changed circumstances, destined to become increasingly irrelevant as the world moved beyond the certainties he'd built his identity around. As the crowd dispersed and normal camp routine resumed, Klaus found himself walking alongside Hans Mueller, both men processing the morning's events and their implications for the future. "Weber's not finished," Hans observed, gingerly touching his swollen nose. "He'll find subtler ways to enforce."
"The key is starting with ideas everyone can accept," Hans explained during their first planning session. "Universal human dignity, individual moral responsibility, the importance of critical thinking. We build from shared values toward democratic conclusions." Otto Fleischer had volunteered as their primary recruiter, using his natural enthusiasm and unthreatening youth to identify prisoners who might be ready for ideological evolution. At 18, he possessed the valuable ability to ask dangerous questions that sounded like innocent curiosity rather than subversive propaganda. "What about the practical stuff?" asked Joseph Hoffman, a former artillery officer who joined their group after witnessing Weber's tribunal. "How do elections actually work? How do you organize political parties? How do you write laws that protect minority rights?" Klaus found himself designated as their connection to American sources, tasked with learning democratic procedures from guards and civilian staff who were happy to explain their system to genuinely curious foreigners. The role put him in regular contact with people like Jimmy Patterson and Sergeant Kowalski, whose casual expertise in democratic participation proved invaluable. "The beautiful thing about democracy," Jimmy explained while they worked on a carburetor together, "is that it assumes people are smart enough to govern themselves if you give them good information and real choices. Most other systems assume people are too stupid or evil to be trusted with power." Klaus translated such insights for his fellow conspirators, building a comprehensive understanding of democratic theory and practice that would serve them well when they returned to whatever remained of Germany. The irony of German prisoners learning American civics from mechanics and farm boys wasn't lost on any of them. Their first formal session attracted 12 prisoners, ostensibly gathered for Otto's English language practice, but actually receiving instruction in comparative government systems.
Klaus had prepared a presentation on different forms of political organization, using his communications training to present complex ideas clearly and persuasively. Consider 3 approaches to organizing human society, he began, speaking in German but using concepts he'd learned from American sources. Authoritarianism assumes that wise leaders know what's best for everyone. Anarchism assumes that no leadership is necessary because people naturally cooperate. Democracy assumes that people are smart enough to govern themselves if you give them good information and real choices.
Most other systems assume people are too stupid or evil to be trusted with power. Klaus translated such insights for his fellow conspirators, building a comprehensive understanding of democratic theory and practice that would serve them well when they returned to whatever remained of Germany. The irony of German prisoners learning American civics from mechanics and farm boys wasn't lost on any of them. Their first formal session attracted 12 prisoners, ostensibly gathered for Otto's English language practice, but actually receiving instruction in comparative government systems. Klaus had prepared a presentation on different forms of political organization, using his communications training to present complex ideas clearly and persuasively. Consider 3 approaches to organizing human society, he began, speaking in German but using concepts he'd learned from American sources. Authoritarianism assumes that wise leaders know what's best for everyone. Anarchism assumes that no leadership is necessary because people naturally cooperate. They talked through the night in Anna's tiny apartment, sharing experiences that bridged the gap between occupied Germany and democratic America. Anna had spent 2 years learning to survive in chaos, while Klaus had learned to thrive in freedom. But both transformations had led to similar conclusions about human dignity and individual responsibility. The real work begins now, Anna said, as dawn illuminated Hamburg's skeletal remains. Building something new from all this destruction. The question is whether enough Germans are ready for democracy, or if they'll choose another strongman who promises easy answers. Klaus thought about Weber's supporters, about the millions of Germans who'd never experienced American kindness, about the seductive appeal of authoritarian certainty in the face of overwhelming complexity. The challenge seemed impossibly large. But he also thought about ice cream shared without humiliation, about baseball games that transcended national boundaries, about young Americans who chose generosity over vengeance because their culture had taught them that human fellowship was worth pursuing, even with former enemies. "We'll teach them," Klaus said with quiet conviction. "One person at a time, one conversation at a time. We'll show them what democracy looks like in practice, how it feels to live without fear of speaking your mind, what strength really means when it's used to protect rather than dominate." Within months, Klaus had joined a local political organization dedicated to democratic education. Otto returned to America and eventually became a naturalized citizen, serving as a bridge between cultures that had learned to respect rather than destroy each other. Hans entered politics and spent decades helping build the stable democracy that West Germany would become. Weber disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany, his dreams of resurgent nationalism eventually relegated to the margins of history, where they belonged. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings in the new Germany they were building together, Klaus would buy ice cream for his own children and tell them stories about Oklahoma sunshine, American generosity, and the revolutionary idea
that enemies could become friends through the simple act of sharing what they had with those who had less. The taste of freedom, once experienced, had proved impossible to forget. It had also proved impossible to keep to themselves.
If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply entertained you during what I hope was an unforgettable listening experience, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with friends who appreciate great storytelling. These novel-length narratives require enormous amounts of research, writing, and production time, but they're worth every hour when they reach audiences who truly value quality content. Make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest epic stories. We're always working on new tales that will transport you to different worlds, different times, and different perspectives that might just change how you see your own life and the people around you. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable journey, from hatred to hope, from certainty to wisdom, from the bitter taste of war to the sweet liberation of understanding. Until next time, keep your minds open, your hearts curious, and remember, sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with something as simple as sharing ice cream with a stranger. This is your storyteller, signing off. See you in the next adventure.